Today we are talking all about keyboard actions, or key beds as they are sometimes called. It's the actual keys that you play on your synthesizer, digital piano or USB MIDI controller keyboard like this one. But what separates a good action from an inferior action? Which specifications should you be looking out for? And what should you be aware of when you're evaluating and testing a keyboard action at home or in the music store? The first thing that you'll probably want to consider, and perhaps the most important, is which size, the number of keys that you should be looking for. We've got 25, 37, 49, 61, 73, 76, 88 if it's going to be full-size keys or mini keys. But that's a huge topic in itself, and if you don't mind, I think we'll cover that in a separate topic, how to choose the number of keys and the pros and cons of each size. So we're not going to dig into that right now, but that video will be coming out shortly, right after this one, and I'll leave a link to it in the video description so you can watch that. But now we'll move on to some of the other important parameters that you need to consider that perhaps you haven't even thought about. Okay, the key length and width does differ between brands and MIDI controllers. For some people that's a really important thing, like the spacing between the octaves, the width of each key and the length of them as you play them on the keyboard here. For me, not such a big deal actually, I can adapt to that, but for some guys it makes a difference. So that's something to be aware of, because there is no actual standard and different manufacturers do vary the size of the keys and even cut costs by providing keyboards with slightly smaller keyboards as well. And of course, the extreme to this is the mini keys, which are about half the size of regular keys. Personally, I don't have a problem with them too much really. I prefer to have the small size, which gives you more keys for the form factor of an instrument. And I'd rather have more keys than keys that are full size. But one thing to be aware of that does make me anyway rather wary about mini keys is that the quality, the build quality and construction of mini keys is often really subpar, and they are prone to breaking. They're not particularly durable. So to summarize, for me, I don't mind the size of mini keys, but I'm very cautious about the build quality of some of the mini keys that tend to be really cheap. So I personally tend to avoid them. Of course, a crucial part of playing piano is the expressiveness, playing dynamically, softly, or playing hardly to get a brighter, louder sound. And for that, you will need touch-sensitive keys, often called velocity responsive keys. They actually measure how fast you strike the keys to get a hard sound or a soft sound, just like that. For me, this is super important. I wouldn't really ever buy a keyboard that didn't have velocity sensitive keys. You can get away with it if you're playing synthesizer sounds, perhaps synth bass or pad sounds, but really just get a keyboard with velocity sensitive keys. Highly recommended and essential if you are going to be playing expressive piano sounds. So aftertouch is when you play the keys, and then after you're holding them down, you continue to hold them down and then just press down harder on the keys. This keyboard does have aftertouch, this particular patch doesn't. But what aftertouch does is add some expressiveness to your performance. By depressing harder on the keys, you can introduce vibrato or perhaps adjust the filter cutoff to make the sound brighter. And it's a really nice way to add some expressiveness to your performances. Then we have the shape and style of the keys. This particular example here, this NIS61, has synthesizer keys that are the most common, I would say. They have a space underneath and a lip that sticks out just like that. Over here we have a digital Hammond organ clone that has waterfall keys. They're called waterfall keys because they have a 90-degree angle at the front of the key that just falls off. So that's two styles of keys to be aware of. On a digital piano, you often have something that looks a bit like a waterfall style key, but with a lip. And the idea of that is that if you're an advanced player and doing quite big intervals, grasping a large span, you can actually hook onto that lip with your little finger and thumb to more securely play that big interval, that big chord. The key travel is another thing that you might need to consider. It's a personal preference, but there is a big difference between keyboards. The key travel is how shallow or deep the key is when you push it down. It's a bit of a personal thing, of course, but for me, I like a keyboard with quite a deep travel, so you can really feel that you're pushing down and depressing those keys. And that's an example of something you'll never see in the specifications. You just have to try out the keyboard yourself to get a feeling of the key travel. Another thing that you won't see on the manufacturer's website is the solidity or the sturdiness of the keys. How do they actually feel underneath your fingers? These ones are actually really good and feel quite solid, but I've had other synthesizer actions that used very, very thin plastic, and you might wonder why that matters. Well, the thing is, if you accidentally strike a key with your fingernail, it really feels awful when you have a very thin, flimsy key that feels very hollow with very thin plastic. It just tends to rattle and it's just not a good feel. Also, how well constructed the keys are themselves. If they are a bit wobbly or loose in the keybed, that's not a particularly nice thing either. And I've also seen keyboards which seem to have quite low quality, where the keys themselves were uneven. Some keys were higher or lower than each other, and that made it awfully unattractive to look at and unappealing to play. In fact, some of the very finest digital piano actions have solid keys. They are a plastic key, but inside they have a wooden core, just like a real acoustic piano, to give a very solid feeling. But for me, certainly, the thickness of the plastic used in the keys and how solid they feel is certainly a really important consideration. It's how we interact with the instrument, make music and get inspired. And if it just feels cheap under my fingertips, I just don't enjoy the experience. Another thing you won't see on the manufacturer's website is sharp edges, but this is another important thing to look out for when evaluating a keyboard action for yourself. Now, what you need to look for is the corners of the keys, if they have any sharp edges or a sharp corner to them. Now, you might think that's not particularly important, but I can tell you it is. If you're playing, again, large intervals, then your fingers will strike the neighboring key on the corner, your thumb or your little finger, and it just doesn't feel very nice. Another consideration is the finish on the keys. This one has a glossy finish on both the white and the black keys. The same thing on the Nord Electro actually. But yeah, the keyboard finish might be important to you. On synthesizers, they tend to be glossy finishes like this. But on some more expensive and premium digital pianos, you'll get a textured finish to simulate the feeling of the ebony and ivory keyboard surfaces. That's a really nice feature as well, and does give you a bit more of a grip on the keys as well as you're holding down chords, which I really like. It just gives you a more luxurious experience as you're playing. Another thing to consider is how hard it is to push down the keys and play. This one's got quite a light action, which is nice. It's the feeling of springiness, how hard the springs are as you push down the keys. The Nord Electro is a lot more springy and harder to push them down, but that's just a personal preference again, and something that I can adapt to quite easily and get used to. As we get into the 73, 76 and 88 note actions, they tend to be weighted keyboard actions. And if you're not sure what that means, it just basically means they've added some weights or small hammers to the keys to make them harder to press down, to give you more like the feel of playing a real acoustic piano. And that's something that's really nice to have on an 88 note piano if you're looking to play piano type instruments like acoustic piano, grand pianos and Rhodes and so on. However, be warned that weighted keyboard actions aren't really ideal for playing synth leads and drums and banging out beats and that kind of thing, because they tend to feel a little bit sluggish and it's hard to get your timing spot on. So if you're playing a lot of instrument sounds, in particular organ actually, it's really nice to have a light, semi-weighted or unweighted keyboard action. Another thing that's really important to me is how the keyboard feels as the action bottoms out, as you press it all the way to the bottom. This one feels really nice and comes to a rest with a nice cushioned feel. Some keyboards can feel a little bit spongy when you hold them down. Again, it might not matter to you, it might not be something you notice, but it's something that I'm always aware of as I'm playing. How does it feel as it strikes the bottom? Does it strike the bottom with a hard clatter, or does it come down nice and softly? Another consideration that's not entirely obvious perhaps, but an important thing, if we turn down the volume here, if you're playing at home or making YouTube videos like I do, you don't want a rattly, clacking keyboard in particular. You're going to disturb the other people in the same room as you, or it's going to be picked up on your microphone. And again, I'm finding this one to be quite satisfactory, but there is a huge difference in the acoustic noise. So that's another thing to watch out for. It's pretty nice actually to have a silky smooth, quiet action like this one. Okay, here's a really important one, and the manufacturers aren't going to tell you anything about this. So if you're playing basic stuff in the key of C, you're not going to really notice the length of the keys. And even more importantly, where they are hinged. If they are hinged somewhere around here on the key, or if they are hinged way back underneath the case where you can't even see it. So you might be wondering, why is that important? Okay, let's talk about key length and the pivot or the hinge point, the fulcrum. And I'm not talking about the part of the key that you can see, but how far it extends back into the keyboard and where the actual hinge point is. And you might be wondering why that is so important. Imagine we have a hinge here, just behind where the visible part of the key. And if that was the case, it would be easy to press the key here, but really hard to press it back here because you're pushing down almost on top of the hinge. It's just a question of physics and levers. It'll be a lot easier to press it here than it is there. The same for the black notes and for the white notes. If we have a hinge point further back into the keyboard, way back here, then the force needed to play the keys there and there is obviously much more similar. Same again for the white notes. Now, in case you're crying out to me, Woody, why does it matter? Nobody plays the keys back here anyway. Well, let me tell you, if you're playing more advanced chords, you will tend to be playing towards the back of the keys, towards the fall board, as this part of the keyboard or piano is called. In C, you may not ever do that. In G, playing simple chords, laying down beats and drum patterns, it won't matter. But say you're playing a B major 7th, just look how my fingers naturally lie there. That chord there, you can see this finger is all the way towards the top. Same again there. So it's actually really normal and good technique to play towards the back of the keys. And if the keys are hinged here, then it's going to be really difficult to play back there with even dynamics, expression and good timing. The tempo gets thrown off if you have to work a little bit harder to press the keys towards the back. A tune I often play to see how well the action plays towards the back of the keys, towards the full board, is Big Chief, which is in the key of E flat or something. Has a lot of black notes. Goes something like this. Haven't played that for a long time, quite obviously, but this was doing okay. If you were to open up a synthesizer that's considered as having a really good keybed, like the Yamaha DX7 or Roland D50, you would see that the keys extend way back into the chassis of the instrument. You will obviously never be able to see that unless you open it up. Now then, if I play the same riff again, I'm having no trouble at all depressing the black keys, even at the very top of the note there. Now this has a trick up its sleeve, this Yamaha DX7. We can just, I've already unscrewed it here. I can flip this up and show you what the keys look like inside. So let's do that now. There we go. Now, of course, the interesting thing to note here is the length of these keys. They are pivoting, the hinge is right here at the back. So as I'm playing any of these keys, you can see they're hinging back there, which gives me a lot of leverage to press down these keys. And if you were to look at a real acoustic piano as well, you'll see the keys are actually about this long, even though you can only see this much of them. And that's to get a good feeling as you play towards the back of the keys. Super important. And I've played some really nice synthesizers where the keys and the pivot point was just too short, and that really turned me off them. Maybe this is something you hadn't given any consideration to before, but now that I've told you, you know, and it will always be in your mind when you're evaluating an action. And I think this is a good thing, because this is an area where the keyboard manufacturers tend to cut corners, cut costs, because they think they can get away with it, and we're not going to let them do that. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found the video helpful and informative. I'll see you next time. Cheerio.